Some believe Mars may have been habitable as little as 10,000 years ago. In the 60s and 70s, the United States launched the Mariner and Viking spacecraft to explore Mars. In one area, called Cydonia, among other puzzling features, a stone carving was seen that looked amazingly like a human face. At other sites on Mars, features could be seen which resemble enigmatic structures on Earth. This is a feature on Mars that NASA nicknamed Inca City. Sacsayhuaman, Peru. Mars. Nazca, Peru, attributed to the gods.
I was especially intrigued by independent researchers' suggestions in their reports that the orientation of the face and adjoining pyramid indicated they were built in alignment with sunrise at solstice time on Mars about 450,000 years ago. According to my conclusions, the Anunnaki had first landed on Earth about 450,000 years ago. It was perhaps no coincidence that the two dates coincide.
The only plausible theory is that someone, neither from Earth nor Mars, capable of space travel almost 500,000 years ago, had visited this part of the solar system and had left behind monuments both on Earth and on Mars. The only beings for which evidence has been found are the Anunnaki.
The Sumerian tablets refer to the station planet Mars as the traveler's ship. I've taken it to mean that it was at Mars that the Anunnaki from Nibiru transferred to smaller spacecraft to reach Earth orbiting stations. Not once every 3,600 years, but on a more frequent schedule. The actual landing on and takeoff from Earth were performed by smaller shuttlecraft.
From some other species, from another planet.
Mars, sometime in its past, was the site of a space base. The unexplained, abrupt end of a Soviet space mission in 1989 suggests that the ancient space base has been reactivated. In October 1988, the Soviet Union sent two spacecraft to investigate Mars, named Phobos-1 and 2, after one of Mars' two moonlets. Although launched by the Soviets, the mission actually represented an international effort of an unprecedented scale, with more than 13 European countries participating officially, and British and American scientists participating personally, though with their governments' knowledge and blessings. Phobos-1 was somehow lost on its way in September 1988. But Phobos-2 did make it to Mars and operated perfectly, sending back to Earth images from the surface of Mars. On March 1, 1989, these pictures of a highly strange grid were received. The grid, here in the upper right, was shot both in the optical and in the infrared range. Later, they were merged into this composite. And here is what this amazing grid looks like once the optical image is enlarged. Then, for the next 24 days, no other pictures were released. On March 26, Phobos-2 sent back images, taken just south of the Martian equator, of this uncanny elliptical shape. aligned with this long linear strip stretching for 300 kilometers. March 27. The Soviets announced sudden problems in keeping radio contacts with Phobos-2. March 30. The Soviet evening TV news Vremya.
Good evening. Tonight we start out with a scoop, a sensational item. News of a report by Western observers that an accident, a catastrophe, has happened to the Soviet space probe Phobos, which is part of an international program in which some 40 countries participate. But now, the facts.
This here represents a unique phenomenon. Before now, no one had ever taken such detailed infrared pictures of Mars.
What part of the planet? This one here?
Approximately, more or less in this area here, marked red. And then there is a very clearly outlined strip starting here and ending here. A strip about 20 to 25 kilometers wide, which is visible in both the optical and infrared range. These are shots taken on one and the same day.
This shadow actually appeared all of a sudden. Why am I calling it a shadow? Because you can see things through it.
So this is an object not suspended about the surface, but actually located on the surface itself?
Yes, of course.
This elliptical shadow, then, is it in Mars' atmosphere or on the planet's surface? Or is it difficult to tell?
One thing is for sure. This something is not positioned horizontally.
Well, to me it looks like a rocket taking off from the surface of Mars and leaving a trail behind. What do you think about that?
Well, if you'd want to fantasize, it could be interpreted that way too. Now we think we ought to look at the real circumstances that have caused that trail, even though they haven't yet been fully clarified. That's more likely to be the shadow of some object, since surface elements can be seen through it.
How long will it take to process all of the information to get more or less objective scientific results, rather than fantastic ones?
Come back in a week.
But 1 week later, no details. 3 weeks later, at a press conference, a scientist of the Soviet Space Research Institute offers this curious, unsolicited statement.
It does take a minimum of precision criteria to obtain on the image these spots, which some would like to call flying saucers, that appeared within the visual field of the infrared range. It must be pointed out that the flying saucer version is not ours. We'd have wanted it to all be that way. Actually, at first we were saying that there was no flying saucer, that surely all that we saw could be explained in understandable, natural and physical terms.
5 months later, in September 1989, British Channel 4 runs a news special on the Phobos mission to Mars.
Last year, the Soviets launched 2 spacecraft to the planet, both named after the Martian moon, Phobos. Their mission was to photograph Mars and land probes on its moon. One was accidentally switched off by a mission operator. But the second reached Mars and transmitted pictures that are still puzzling Soviet scientists. As it swung over the equator, it took pictures from a height of 6,000 kilometers. This is an infrared photograph. It shows differences in temperature. The dark patches are colder. This section covers 600 kilometers. It shows objects down to the size of 2 kilometers. It's the most detailed infrared picture of the planet's surface.
We have some very, very thin lines on the surface of Mars in the infrared, which means it's heat. I mean, it's not visible, it's heat. You can see it through clouds if you want to do it. These have a resolution, these have a width, I would guess, of 3 or 4 kilometers wide. Now, in answer to the question of what it is, I certainly don't know, and the Russians aren't telling us.
Scientists are also puzzled by this shadow pictured on the surface of Mars by both optical and heat-seeking cameras. They're convinced it's a shadow because they can see objects on the surface beneath. But a shadow of what? Finally, there's the mystery of the vanishing spacecraft. The Russians have yet to release the last picture transmitted by Phobos before it lost contact with ground control. But the Russians have said that it shows an object coming towards the spacecraft, an object which, in their words, should not have been there.
The spacecraft was circling Mars, coming into the same orbit as the moons of Mars. And the last picture, they got halfway through it, and they saw something there which shouldn't be there. Professor Kapitsa makes the joke that it's Martian people.
British scientists will be able to judge for themselves when the Soviets bring their pictures to a conference at Exeter next month. Because, of course, there must be a sensible explanation, mustn't there?
But the Russians brought no pictures to Exeter. So, what about the spacecraft's disappearance?
One possibility could easily be that a small meteorite, a small bit of rock, was in the same orbit as Phobos and hit it.
But in an exclusive interview with us in October 1990 in Moscow, Professor Lev Mukhin of the Soviet Space Research Institute discredited the dust theory.
There were attempts to hypothesize that there had been a collision between the space probe, which was then orbiting Mars in alignment with the orbit of Mars moonlet, and strands of dust surrounding the moon Phobos itself. But some fairly accurate computations made by several organizations and by our institute as well have shown that this assumption is totally baseless.
If not dust, then what? A long spell of silence followed until, in December 1991, former cosmonaut trainee and retired Soviet Air Force Colonel Marina Popovich held a surprise press conference at the Russian consulate in San Francisco, where she showed off this photograph reportedly taken by one of the Phobos craft. It shows in the foreground a strange shape, which Marina Popovich called an unidentified flying object, what we refer to as a UFO, clearly set off against what appears to be Mars moonlit Phobos in the background. So, what about the mysterious shadow? Well, the Russians said it turned up all of a sudden, that it was something that shouldn't have been there, a shadow of some object above the Martian surface. But that's not all. In April 1992, as we examined these other images, all taken within minutes from each other, we discovered that the shadow had actually been moving.
So the mystery remains, what caused the spacecraft to destabilize? Was it a malfunction, or was there an outside cause, perhaps an impact? The question that arises is indeed a simple one. Was the spacecraft Phobos-2 hit by something that put it out of commission? The circumstances in which Phobos-2 was lost suggest that someone might be back on Mars, someone ready to knock out what to them is an alien spacecraft.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Fascinating. Stay tuned for Scott Felton after the break. Why not join me, Richard D. Hall, live for an evening on board the Starship at the Oaken Gates Theatre in Telford, 11th of May 2011. In the show, I'll be addressing many of the areas I've covered over the past year, including false flag terrorism, UFOs, animal mutilation, the financial crisis, and more. Learn what your government isn't telling you and what your media isn't allowed to tell you. Tickets are available now from the Oaken Gates Theatre website. Further future venues include Weston-super-Mare, Leeds, Barnsley and Newcastle upon Tyne, with further venues to be arranged. Find more details on the richplanet.net website.